Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. On a cold, silent November night, in the heart of an American city, 3 McDonald's employees were closing up the restaurant after a normal workday. McDonald's, located on a quiet street, has always been a common place for city residents, a meeting point for young people, and a nighttime refuge for those looking for a quick snack. But that night, something was about to change. Something inexplicable was lurking among the tables and kitchen aisles, ready to reveal its horrors. The protagonist, Ryan, a 24-year-old young man, had just started working as a store manager. He was pragmatic, skeptical, and did not believe in anything supernatural. For him, McDonald's was just a temporary job until he got something more meaningful. By his side was Hannah, a shy but very efficient employee, and Marcos, an extroverted attendant who liked to make jokes and tease others. They were on the last part of their shift, cleaning the floors and making sure everything was in order before locking the doors. However, something strange happened right after they turned off the lights. Ryan heard a noise coming from the kitchen, as if someone was moving utensils. When he went to investigate, he found no one. Everything seemed in order, but he felt an inexplicable shiver run down his spine. Hannah also started hearing strange sounds coming from the bathrooms, and Marcos swore he saw something moving in the shadows of the empty cafeteria. The tension grew, and soon the 3 stories began to unfold, each one more bizarre than the other, linked to an evil presence that seemed to be lurking inside that McDonald's. As the minutes dragged on that night, the feeling of discomfort only increased. Ryan was trying to remain calm, insisting that there was no big deal, just some logical explanation for the strange sounds. He knew the building was old, and perhaps the facilities were beginning to show signs of wear and tear. But as he looked at his colleagues, he saw that they were not so convinced. Marcos was restless, looking everywhere as if he was trying to protect himself from something invisible. Hannah, on the other hand, looked completely scared, and her eyes were fixed on the emergency door, as if something was approaching. "I swear I heard a voice," Hannah said, her voice shaking. "It was coming from the hallway behind the kitchen. I wasn't alone there. There was someone." Ryan frowned. "Hannah, you're just tired. Let's finish cleaning up, lock up, and go home." But before he could continue, a scream cut through the air. Marcos, who was in the cafeteria, jumped back, dropping the tray he was carrying. He was pale, eyes wide, pointing at the wall. "There!" Marcos exclaimed, his voice filled with dread. "I saw it! Something moved!" Ryan, feeling the nervousness spreading, walked to the place where Marcos was pointing. Nothing was visible, but the feeling that something was watching them was inescapable. It was then that the light flashed. The restaurant's light bulbs began to fail, and the shadows on the wall danced, taking on human-like shapes. The silence was interrupted only by the sound of the wind passing under the door, creating an even more disturbing sensation. "Let's get out of here now," Ryan said, fear now infecting his voice. But before they could move, the McDonald's emergency phone rang. It was a direct line to the franchise's central office. Ryan answered, hoping to hear the voice of someone who could explain what had happened. "McDonald's, good evening," he said, trying to sound firm. On the other side, a cold, distant voice replied, "There is something you need to know. You are not alone. Don't leave there. Don't leave now." Ryan felt a shiver run through his body. The voice seemed to know every detail of McDonald's, but he had never heard it before. Before he could ask further, the call was abruptly cut off. "That's not right," Hannah said, her voice now barely audible. The tension only increased, and now, more than ever, the 3 were feeling trapped in an invisible trap. The lights went out for good, and the restaurant was plunged into complete darkness. All that could be heard were the sounds of the wind and the distant sound of a whistle, as if something was approaching. It was at that moment that the first mystery began to reveal itself. On one of the oldest walls in the restaurant, near the bathroom area, a message began to appear in an unsettling manner, written in what looked like blood. The words were clear: "You're next." Ryan felt the weight of fear settle in his chest. He no longer knew if this was a bad joke, a technical failure, or something much more sinister. The darkness became more and more oppressive. The sound of flashing lights still echoed through the hallways, and the feeling that something wasn't right was inescapable. The message on the wall, written in what appeared to be blood, seemed to move, the words blurring as time passed. Ryan, with his heart racing, tried to maintain his composure, but his mind could no longer find a rational explanation for what was happening. "This is real. It's not possible," Marcos mutters, his hands trembling, holding his flashlight. The emergency light, which should have been enough to illuminate the dark corners of the restaurant, was starting to fail, creating menacing shadows that seemed to move on their own. Hannah was in shock, her eyes fixed on the wall, where the message continued to expand, the letters distorting as a muffled sound filled the air. It was when they heard a noise in the back of the kitchen, coming from the freezer, that the tension became unbearable. Ryan, now completely out of control, cautiously approached the scene. He knew he should get out of there, but curiosity and fear pushed him forward, taking him to the freezer. As soon as he opened the door, a nauseating smell invaded his nostrils. Inside, there was no food or ingredients, but something much more disturbing. There, at the bottom of the freezer, were several old masks stacked on top of each other, all with facial expressions of terror and despair. Hannah screamed at the sight, and Ryan quickly backed away, slamming the freezer door shut. The feeling that something was watching him made him look back. That's when, in the reflection of the freezer's glass door, he saw a figure moving in the darkness of the kitchen. A tall figure with a distorted, faceless shadow that seemed to be slowly approaching. The sound of Marcos's heavy breathing and the stamping of his hurried feet echoed through the air. "We need to leave now," he shouted, panic taking over his voice. But before they could move, the restaurant's emergency doors closed with a deafening bang, locking them inside. Ryan's cell phone started ringing again, but this time the call wasn't coming from an outside source. The cell phone screen displayed a strange message sent from an unknown number. "They are here. They can't escape." The figure that had been watching from the kitchen was now behind them, but when they turned around, there was nothing. The feeling of being followed, however, intensified, as if the walls of McDonald's had come alive, moving as they tried to find a way out. Ryan, now desperate, ran to the manager's office where there was a security system. When he accessed the cameras, he saw something that chilled his blood. The images showed the three of them in several different parts of the restaurant, but other shadowy and spectral figures also appeared and moved towards them. Dread gripped his mind, and he knew, somewhere deep down, that something supernatural was happening. They were not alone. That's when a new message appeared on the camera system's screen. "You are the chosen ones." Panic set in, and the feeling that they were being watched by something much older and more evil became unbearable. The fear had turned into absolute dread. The three were now inside McDonald's, a place that previously seemed to be just an ordinary restaurant, but had now become a prison, with a dark presence that watched them at every step. What was once a peaceful night, full of casual conversations and laughter, had turned into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Ryan felt the weight of fear and responsibility on his shoulders. He was the manager, the person who was supposed to keep everyone safe. But now, nothing made sense. He looked at himself in the mirror in the manager's office and barely recognized his own reflection, his eyes full of terror and his face pale. The dark presence, which was beginning to manifest itself more intensely, was taking over everyone's minds. "We have to do something, or we're not going to get out of here alive," Marcos said, his voice low and shaky. He was perched on his work desk, eyes darting frantically from side to side. Ryan felt a flame of determination ignite within him. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he couldn't allow fear to overwhelm him. He couldn't let his friends suffer for his inaction. "We will find a way out. Something brought us here, and we will understand what it is." Ryan took a deep breath and looked at his friends. "I know it seems impossible, but we need to come together. We can't let this thing win." As Marcos and Hannah nodded in agreement, the atmosphere in the restaurant became even more oppressive. The shadows, which before were just simple distortions, now took on defined shapes. The spectral figures on the security cameras were closer. They could hear them, almost as if they were next door, their whispers penetrating the walls and their hearts. Ryan's first action was to try to unblock the emergency door, but to his dismay, there was no way to unlock it. The electrical system was failing completely, and the lights began to flicker, creating flashes of light that briefly revealed the silhouettes of the lurking creatures. He needed to think of something quickly. It was then that he remembered the basement, an abandoned part of the restaurant that they never used. Maybe if they could get down and find out what was going on there, they could finally escape, or at least understand what was haunting them. Let's go to the basement. Maybe we'll get some answers there, said Ryan, trying to stay calm, but his heart was beating fast. The path to the basement was dark and silent, with the shadows of the figures moving closer and closer. Hannah, visibly scared, gripped Ryan's arm tightly, her eyes never leaving the stairs, leading down to the lower level. Marcos, although a little more optimistic, was also restless, his mind filled with chaotic thoughts about what could be waiting for them down there. When they arrived at the basement, the iron door was locked, but when they tried to open it, they noticed something strange. The air was colder there, and the environment seemed to be breathing. It was as if the place itself was alive. Ryan, now determined to confront what was happening, grabbed an iron bar he found nearby and forced the door open. Inside the basement, the walls were covered with what appeared to be a sticky substance, and the floor was covered in a layer of thick dust. In the center of the cellar there was a table with unlit candles around it and a large wooden box. As Ryan approached, he felt an intense cold, as if something was pulling him into the box. Hannah took a step back, her face contorting in fear. "Ryan, don't open this." But he couldn't resist. With shaking hands, he lifted the lid of the box. Inside, there were a series of old objects, yellowed photographs, and a metal mask. The same type of mask he had seen in the freezer earlier. The instant he touched the mask, a wave of energy coursed through his body. A deep whisper invaded his mind. "You found it. You are the chosen one." The ground shook, and the lights began to flicker violently. The shadowy figures that haunted the restaurant now stood before them, no longer as shadows, but as real entities, with empty eyes and distorted mouths. They were furious at being discovered, at being challenged. Ryan, feeling a strange power in his hands, took the mask. It was as if the piece of metal was linked to his soul, connecting him directly to those entities. He realized that the only way to deal with this was to confront the force that McDonald's represented. The restaurant, once just a fast food place, had been a place where something evil had been hiding for years, a curse that was now trying to possess them. "I'm going to end this," said Ryan, now more confident, as his friends looked on with a mixture of fear and hope. The atmosphere in the basement was charged with an electric, menacing energy. The entities that materialized before them were approaching, their bodies floating in the air, with their hands outstretched towards the three. The air was thick, almost impenetrable, and the feeling that time had stopped was palpable. Ryan, now with the metal mask in his hands, felt an unknown power pulsing within him. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but one thing was clear: this was their only chance to confront the evil that surrounded them. The entities approached, whispering incomprehensible words. Their voices were like a chorus of laments, a combination of pain and anger. The main figure, a tall, distorted creature, advanced toward Ryan, its empty, soulless eyes fixed on him. "You shouldn't have touched it." The creature's voice echoed, deep and menacing, as if it were coming from somewhere beyond this world. "Now you will be part of us." Ryan felt an extreme cold take over his body, but at the same time, a surge of courage overcame him. He knew he couldn't run away. His friends, Hannah and Marcos, were paralyzed with fear, but he couldn't leave them behind. Not now. With shaking hands, he placed the mask on his face. As he did so, a wave of power and light coursed through his body, illuminating the basement with blinding intensity. The entities retreated momentarily, their angry expressions now mixed with surprise. Ryan felt his body being taken over by a supernatural energy, and his mind was invaded by visions of the restaurant's past. Moments of ancient rituals, sacrifices and pacts made to keep McDonald's running, but at the cost of lost souls. He realized then the restaurant was not just an ordinary place. It had been built over an ancient cemetery, a cursed plot of land where ancient cults had performed dark rituals, and McDonald's had been chosen as a place where souls would be captured. The entities were no ordinary ghosts. They were the lost souls of people who had been drawn there over the years, enslaved to keep the curse alive. "Now I understand," Ryan murmured, his voice charged with new power. He was in tune with the forces that lived there, but at the same time, he knew he must use them to free his friends and destroy the curse once and for all. With an abrupt movement, Ryan extended his hands, and a burst of intense light erupted from his body. The entities screamed, their distorted figures being pushed back, as if an invisible force was tearing them from their grasp. The McDonald's energy that had previously imprisoned them began to dissipate, and the heavy air became lighter. The entities tried to resist, but Ryan's strength, now amplified by the mask, was uncontrollable. They twisted and slowly disappeared, being sucked into a kind of invisible vortex. Before they could speak again, the light swallowed them, and the restaurant was enveloped in absolute silence. McDonald's, which once seemed like a doomed place, was now at peace. The shadows dissipated, and the heavy air disappeared. Ryan removed the mask from his face, feeling profound exhaustion. The restaurant lights came on again, as if nothing had happened. Hannah and Marcos, who were paralyzed with fear, finally moved. They looked around, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "Ryan, did you do it?" Hannah asked, her voice small, still shocked. Ryan looked at the two of them, his words filled with relief but also a sense of heaviness. "Yes, but this is not something we will soon forget." The truth was, even though the entities had been defeated, a part of Ryan knew that McDonald's would never be the same. The place, with its dark past, could never be completely erased. However, he had saved his friends and freed himself from a curse that would last for generations. The silence in McDonald's was now comforting, but in a strange way. The oppressive energy that had taken over the restaurant all night was finally gone, as if it had been ripped away once and for all. The light from the lamps, which had previously flickered with frightening intensity, was now steady, illuminating the space in an almost welcoming way. The shadows faded, and the thick air finally became breathable. It seemed that, after everything they had experienced, the darkness that inhabited that place had been dissolved. Ryan, with his hands still shaking and the feeling of intense exhaustion, took a step back and watched his two friends. Hannah was trying to process what had happened, her gaze lost, while Marcos was still but visibly relieved. We made it out," Hannah said, with a lightness that Ryan didn't feel. She seemed to be recovering from the shock, but the expression on her face showed that she knew something had changed forever. What was that? What happened to those things? Ryan took a deep breath, still trying to understand the implications of everything he had experienced that night. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's over now. We no longer have to fear, but this place, it will never be the same." Marcos approached him, touching his shoulder tightly. "But you were amazing, man. I thought we weren't going to make it out alive. You saved us." Ryan looked at his friends, feeling a wave of gratitude and regret at the same time. He had faced something beyond human understanding, something that had tested his limits of courage and endurance. But as he looked at those he loved, he knew this had all been more than a simple fight against the supernatural. It was a matter of survival, of fighting to protect those at your side, no matter what was threatening them. "It wasn't just me," Ryan replied with a tired smile. We did it because we were together. It doesn't matter what happened. We're alive, and that's all that matters now." The three hugged each other, their hearts still racing, but with a feeling of relief beginning to set in. They had faced the worst of what this place had to offer, and now they were free. McDonald's, however, was no longer just a restaurant. It was a place marked by an inexplicable event, something none of the three of them could ever forget. Before they left, Ryan looked at the place one more time. McDonald's looked the same, but he knew nothing would ever be the same. The place's dark past would never be erased, and the feeling that something might return one day would always stay with him. "Let's go. This place doesn't belong to us anymore," Ryan said, a decision in his voice. So they walked out the door, the cool night air washing over them as they walked towards their cars. The streets were silent, but the city seemed different, as if the universe itself had moved to accommodate what had happened. As McDonald's fell behind, now a silent structure in the middle of the night, the three knew their lives would never be the same. But at the same time, a sense of liberation filled them. They had faced the deepest fear and survived. But Ryan, looking at his friends, knew that even if the battle was over, the story of McDonald's would never be truly forgotten. Something had been released there, and although they had won the war, the evil that lived there, now dispersed, could one day return. And somewhere deep down he felt that the fight wasn't over yet. But for now, they were safe. They had overcome the impossible. And in doing so, they had transformed themselves forever. Weeks have passed since that night. Ryan, Hannah, and Marcos returned to their everyday lives, but something was different. The fear of McDonald's still haunted them, but they no longer talked about what had happened. It seemed that silence was the only way to deal with the horrors they had faced. Ryan, however, couldn't help but visit the place one last time. When he got there, the restaurant was closed, but the lights inside were on. He looked at the building with an uneasy feeling, as if something was watching him from inside. But as he looked up at the starry sky, he felt a small peace. The battle, at least for him, was won. As he walked away, he felt the strange certainty that someday McDonald's might reveal its secrets again. But for now, he walked away, carrying with him the memory of a night that could never be erased. The terror had been faced, but the scars, although invisible, would remain. Before we go any further, if you like my content like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what time you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without more interruptions, let's move on to the next story. The clock showed 11:45 p.m. and the movement at the small McDonald's in the suburb of Ridgefield, Ohio, started to decrease. The persistent rain made the night even quieter. Clara, a 21-year-old college student, was on her last shift before a well-deserved weekend off. Working the night shift was always tiring, but that Friday felt more suffocating than usual. The restaurant was run by a grumpy manager, Trevor, who always insisted on cutting costs, even safety protocols. Only Clara, Trevor, and Kyle, the young rookie responsible for cleaning, were on duty that night. At the beginning of the shift, Clara felt something strange. The kitchen radio, which normally played 80s hits, produced intermittent static noise. The wind howled, and the large drive-through windows shook with each gust. "Do you feel that way too?" Kyle asked as he scrubbed the floor near the freezer. "It's like there's something here," Clara laughed, trying to ignore the feeling of discomfort. "It's just the midnight shift. It always gives me the creeps, and I've heard too many ghost stories around here." Kyle hesitated. "Like which ones?" Clara sighed. "There's a story that old employees tell. They say that 10 years ago, a delivery man disappeared after coming to leave an order here. He parked the truck but never left. The security cameras went offline at the same time." Kyle's eyes widened, clearly regretting asking. As the night progressed, something began to go wrong. First, the monitors displaying drive-through orders flickered, showing disjointed words such as "help me" and "get out." Trevor, irritated, blamed the rain. "It's just interference. Get on with your work and stop wasting time on stupid stories," he grumbled as he typed something on his laptop. Clara tried to focus on preparing the snacks, but she couldn't ignore the constant shiver on the back of her neck. Little by little, small anomalies began to emerge. The sound of footsteps in the back hallway, a shadow that seemed to move beyond the kitchen, and the drive-through bell ringing, even without cars in the area. Finally, at 2 a.m., Trevor disappeared. Clara and Kyle searched the restaurant for him, but only found his laptop open to an empty page. Next to the computer, a message scrawled in red pen. "It's not safe here. They know you're watching." That's when the freezer door opened on its own. Clara and Kyle froze when they heard the metallic sound of the freezer door slowly opening. A draft of frigid air escaped, carrying an odor that shouldn't be there, something between rotting flesh and rusty iron. "Trevor?" Clara called, her voice trembling. With no response, Kyle tried to illuminate the interior with his cell phone's flashlight. The light flickered, and he saw something that made his face lose color, deep scratch marks on the inside wall of the freezer, as if something had tried to get out. Before they could react, the door slammed shut, locking them out. A low, guttural noise began to echo through the kitchen, as if someone was laughing, but in a distorted and superhuman way. "This isn't normal," Kyle whispered, stepping back. Clara picked up the phone to call the police, but the device had no signal. The radio in the kitchen, now completely static, began to emit a voice. "You guys shouldn't be here. He's coming." Clara tried to turn off the radio, but he continued to talk, louder and louder. The restaurant's lights flickered, and the security cameras showed impossible images. The McDonald's was empty, but the screens showed shadowy figures, motionless, spread across the tables in the room. Kyle panicked and ran towards the exit. He pulled hard on the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, like a safe. Clara caught up with him and tried to calm him down. "Hey, calm down. Let's find a way out. Is it just an electrical failure or—" Before he could finish, the drive-through bell rang. The sound echoed through the empty restaurant. They looked at each other. "There's no one out there," Clara said, but Kyle didn't want to wait to find out. He ran to the drive-through window and looked out. At first it seemed empty. Then he saw a pair of eyes glowing in the dark, staring at him. Clara pulled him away before he could react. "Don't look at that," he shouted, trying to get him away from the window, but it was too late. Kyle started mumbling incoherent things, as if he was in a trance. Clara shook him. "Kyle, look at me, focus!" The noise from the drive-through sounded again, and Clara caught a glimpse of the figure outside. She was tall, with an impossibly thin silhouette and elongated limbs that almost touched the ground. She blinked, and the figure disappeared, but the bell continued to ring. Clara decided to act. She grabbed Kyle and took him to the manager's office, locking the door behind them. "We need to protect ourselves. Let's wait until dawn." What she didn't notice was that Trevor's laptop, still on the table, began to display text, as if someone was typing, "He's in. There's no point in running." Suddenly, the lights went out completely. The manager's office was in darkness, except for the bluish light from the laptop screen. The text continued to appear, each word appearing slowly, as if an invisible finger was typing, "You're the last ones. He won't stop until he's done." Clara held Kyle's hand, who was still muttering disjointed words. He looked in shock, his eyes staring into space. "Kyle, listen to me. I need you here," she begged, but he just pointed at the laptop. The screen flashed, and a new message appeared. "You have to choose who stays and who leaves." Clara felt a chill run down her spine when she read the words. "Choose what? What is this talking about?" Before he could think of a response, the office door began to shake. First with small bumps, then with violent blows. Something was on the other side, trying to get in. "We're not opening," Clara said, trying to sound confident, but her voice betrayed fear. Kyle, who was still frozen, began to laugh softly. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was guttural, hoarse, as if it wasn't coming from him. When Clara tried to grab his shoulders, he finally looked her in the eyes. His face was different, distorted by an expression that didn't look human. "He's already here," Kyle whispered, his voice overlaid with a deep sound, as if another entity was speaking along with him. Suddenly, the laptop showed a live stream. It was the view from the freezer camera. Inside was Trevor, still and motionless, his eyes wide and lifeless. Behind him, a tall, shadowy figure approached, long, disproportionate arms stretching like tentacles towards him. Clara felt panic take over. She knew she needed to get out of there, but she couldn't leave Kyle in that state. Holding his shoulder, she tried to shake him again. "Kyle, I need you to wake up, please." The office door gave way with a bang. Instead of an empty corridor, there was absolute darkness. Something began to emerge from within her. Pale hands, long fingers that scratched the ground as they slowly advanced. Clara pulled Kyle back, but he resisted. He was smiling now, with an evil glint in his eyes. "You don't understand, Clara. We cannot escape." Suddenly, the shadowy figure completely entered the office. It was much taller than she imagined. The ceiling seemed to curve to accommodate her. His presence was overwhelming, as if it sucked all the air out of the room. The figure raised one hand, pointing directly at Clara. Kyle, as if obeying an invisible order, stood up and walked towards her, holding her arms tightly. Clara screamed and tried to break free, but Kyle whispered in her ear, "It's too late for us." Clara knew something had taken Kyle. His eyes, once friendly and insecure, now reflected a cold, implacable emptiness. He held her tightly, preventing any attempt to escape, while the shadowy figure remained motionless, watching with eyes that glowed like embers. "What do you want from us?" Clara screamed, her voice echoing in the room as if sucked into the surrounding darkness. The entity did not respond with words, but something invaded its mind. A deep, ancient, visceral voice reverberated in his head. "Choices, sacrifices. It's always been like this. He came because you stayed. He will stay because you resisted." Suddenly, Clara was flooded with visions, images of missing people, faces she vaguely recognized from neighborhood stories. They were all in the same restaurant, facing the same dilemma. The entity had consumed them, one by one, always asking for the same thing, a choice. She returned to the present, the screams of the visions still resonating in her mind. Kyle, or whatever he was now, squeezed his arm tighter. "It's simple, Clara. Someone needs to stay." So he lets the other one go. "I won't let you do this," she said, struggling to free herself. But Kyle laughed. "Do you think you have a choice?" Clara remembered the freezer. Something about the marks on the walls and Trevor's fate indicated that this wasn't the first time this had happened. Maybe if I could get there, I could discover something that would help them escape. With a sudden movement, Clara broke away from Kyle and ran to the door. The shadowy figure tried to reach her, but its movements were slow, as if the reality around it was distorted. Clara walked down the hall, feeling the air around her become heavier with each step. She reached the freezer and opened the door with difficulty. Inside, the temperature was suffocating despite the freezing air. Trevor's body was still there, his eyes staring into space, but something on the ground caught his attention, an old, handmade engraving in the concrete. It was a circle with symbols that Clara didn't recognize, but in the center was the phrase, "To seal, return what was taken." "What was taken?" she asked aloud. The answer came in the form of Kyle's screams, echoing through the restaurant. Clara realized the entity didn't just want choices, it wanted lives, an exchange to stay in the place where it fed. She looked at Trevor and approached the body, whispering, "I'm sorry, but if there's still something I can do, I'll try." Clara dragged her body to the center of the circle and recited the words inscribed on the floor. The entity appeared in the freezer door, its eyes glowing with anger. "That's not going to work," Kyle said, his voice overlaid with the same distorted tone as the creature. But Clara continued. As he repeated the words, the ground began to shake, and the shadowy figure hesitated. A deafening scream echoed, and Clara was thrown against the wall. When he opened his eyes, the figure had disappeared. Kyle was lying on the floor of the freezer, unconscious. For a moment, Clara believed she had won, but then The freezer door started closing by itself. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The last thing she saw was Kyle slowly getting up, now completely taken over by the entity, as the door closed, sealing her in eternal ice. The freezer was dark and getting colder. Clara felt the cold air burning her lungs as she desperately tried to open the door, but it was useless. The entity had sealed the space, turning it into an ice prison. On the other side of the door, Clara heard slow, steady footsteps. Kyle, or whatever he was now, seemed to be getting closer. His voice, echoing with a supernatural timbre, reverberated through the environment. "You tried to fight the inevitable. Now you will be part of it." Clara leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm her mind. Think. There must be a way out." His eyes ran along the walls of the freezer, lingering again on the scratch marks. These marks were not just signs of desperation. They formed a pattern. She followed the traces with her frozen fingers until she found something, a loose piece of metal wall. Hidden there was a small object, an ancient medallion engraved with symbols similar to the ones she saw in the circle on the floor. A memory invaded his mind. It was a site that didn't belong to her, an ancient ritual being performed in this place many years before McDonald's was built. The place was a cursed land, and the entity had been sealed there for generations, but with constant sacrifices to keep it contained. The medallion seemed to be the key to breaking the cycle, but how to use it? Outside, Kyle's voice became louder. "You can't run away. This place belongs to me, and now so do you." Clara held the medallion tightly, her hands trembling and almost frozen. She whispered a prayer, even though she didn't know if anyone was listening, and began to recite the symbols she saw on the object. Suddenly, the temperature inside the freezer dropped even further. The ground began to crack, and a blinding light emerged from the symbols Clara held. The shadowy figure burst through the door, screaming in fury as he realized what she was trying to do. "You can't destroy me. I am eternal." Clara ignored the screams, focusing only on the symbols on the medallion. The light grew, enveloping the creature and all the space around it. Kyle, still possessed, was thrown against the wall, but for a moment his eyes returned to normal. "Clara, you can do it," he whispered before being enveloped by light. The entity roared, and the entire McDonald's began to shake. The windows exploded, the ceiling shattered, and Clara felt her body being pulled into the center of the light. With one last effort, she pressed the locket against the ground and shouted the final words engraved on it, "Be sealed forever." An absolute silence took over the place. When Clara opened her eyes, she was alone in what was left of the restaurant. The floor was cracked, equipment was destroyed, and there was no sign of Kyle or the entity. Clara tried to get up, but her strength was gone. She knew she had won, but the price had been too high. As she looked up at the destroyed ceiling, the moonlight illuminated the medallion in her hands, now dull, but with a weight she would never forget. The silence that dominated McDonald's was almost deafening. Clara was lying among the rubble, the medallion cold and lifeless in her hand. Everything around him seemed unrecognizable. The restaurant, which had previously been just a banal symbol of everyday life, was now a scene of devastation. She forced her body to rise, fighting the exhaustion and cold that still gripped her limbs. The air felt strange, as if the place had been drained of all energy. The medallion, although seemingly inert, felt like it weighed tons in his hands. "Kyle," he whispered, looking around, but he wasn't there. Clara limped through the destroyed corridors, passing overturned tables and the remains of glass scattered across the floor. Every step was a painful reminder of what had happened. Fight marks were everywhere, but the restaurant was empty. There were no bodies, neither of the entity, nor of Trevor, nor of Kyle. When he reached the main door, he noticed something strange. The McDonald's sign was out, and the parking lot looked abandoned for years. She approached the entrance and looked out. It was as if the world had changed. Cars passed on the distant road, but no one stopped. There were no sirens, no signs that anyone had noticed what had happened. It was as if the battle he had fought had taken place in a dimension completely separate from the rest of reality. Clara felt tears welling up as she processed everything. Kyle was lost. Trevor, too. And her. He had won, but at what cost? As he tried to reason, he heard a sound coming from the parking lot. It was low, almost imperceptible, but familiar. The sound of a bell. She slowly turned around and saw a figure at the back of the parking lot. She was tall, thin, with disproportionate arms and a presence that froze Clara's blood. The bell rang again, and the figure raised its hand, pointing at her. "No, it can't be," Clara whispered, stepping back. The medallion in his hand suddenly began to heat up, as if reacting to the creature's presence. She looked at it, and a new engraving appeared on the worn surface. It never ends. Clara felt despair taking over. She had fought, she had sacrificed everything, but the entity was still there, waiting for the next choice. She knew at that moment that she was trapped in an endless cycle. The McDonald's was permanently closed a week after the incident. Officially, the justification was structural, safety problems related to ground instability. No employee was located after the incident, and Clara, as the last person seen at the scene, became a mysterious figure for the small suburban town. Months later, Clara lived in a constant state of alert. She had moved to a simple apartment in a distant state, trying to start over, but the weight of events did not leave her alone. On a cold winter morning, Clara sat in her small room, the medallion resting on the table. She had tried to destroy it several times, fire, acid, even hammering, but nothing would scratch it. The object seemed indestructible, as if it were tied to the very essence of the entity. Clara spent sleepless nights, hearing the echo of the bell in her mind, even when it didn't ring. Sometimes he saw figures in unexpected places, in the reflection of the mirror, in the shadows of the hallway, in the corners of his vision. She knew the entity was there, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. One night, Clara took a notebook and started writing down everything that had happened. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was her way of leaving a record in case the entity came back to take her. The last page said, "If you found this, the medallion is nearby. Don't try to use it. Don't try to seal the entity. Just run." Months later, on the abandoned land of the old McDonald's, the building had already been demolished. In its place, a new restaurant began to take shape. Workers commented among themselves about the strange happenings at the site. Tools disappeared. Noises echoed during the night, and some swore they heard a distant bell. The night before the inauguration, one of the workers found something buried in the newly turned earth, an ancient medallion, engraved with indecipherable symbols. Curious, he put it in his pocket, not knowing what had awakened him. The cycle had begun again. Before we go any further, if you like my content like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what time you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without more interruptions, let's move on to the next story. In a small rural town in the United States, the local McDonald's was at the end of a dead-end street. The restaurant, with its neon lights blinking dimly in the distance, felt like a familiar refuge, a constant in a city where the nights were always silent. But that night things wouldn't be normal. It was a Friday, and the night shift was coming to an end. Only 3 people were still working: Sarah, the young manager of the place, Noah, one of the attendants, and Lisa, the cook. They were used to the quiet, almost monotonous routine of Friday nights, with only the occasional customer to keep them company. Sarah had always enjoyed her work, but there was something about that night that made her feel strange. The restaurant was empty. A peculiar silence filled the space, and the strong wind outside seemed to increase the feeling of isolation. She looked at the clock. There were only a few minutes left before closing, but she felt a growing pressure in her chest, an inexplicable feeling of discomfort. When Noah entered the kitchen, his pale face was the only clue that something was wrong. "Did you see that?" Noah asked, his voice shaking. He was staring blankly at the counter, where the chairs were arranged in an abnormal manner, all facing the opposite side of the room. Sarah frowned and went to the counter to check. Everything seemed normal, except for a persistent feeling that something or someone was there, watching. She looked at Lisa, who was in the kitchen, and the woman didn't seem to notice anything unusual. But Sarah knew. There was something in the air, something dark, as if the very structure of the restaurant was charged with negative energy. "Are you okay, Sarah?" Noah asked, his eyes fixed on her face. She turned to him, trying to hide her tension. "Yeah, I don't know. Something feels wrong." That's when they heard the sound, a muffled noise coming from the back of the restaurant. It sounded like the sound of something dragging on the floor, like a chair being slowly moved, or maybe something heavier, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" Sarah shouted with a tone of authority, trying to regain her composure, but no one responded. The silence returned, even heavier than before, so they decided to check it out. Sarah took the key from the back area, and the three of them went to the service door. The dim light of the corridor guided them, but the feeling that something was approaching them, like an invisible presence, increased with each step. "We should go back," Noah murmured, his voice filled with fear. "I don't like it." Lisa, usually a practical and tough woman, was visibly nervous, her eyes wide. "Sarah, this isn't normal." The door creaked open. At the end of the corridor, what awaited them was not just darkness, but a macabre environment, as if time was standing still there. The odor of mold and something more metallic surrounded them. That's when Sarah saw it. A shadow moved along the opposite wall. "See that?" Sarah whispered, pointing to the shadow that stretched and writhed as if it were an extension of something living, something that didn't belong in this world. Before anyone could react, a series of shrill screams echoed throughout the restaurant. The lights flickered, and the McDonald's sound system began playing distorted, grotesque music, a melody that seemed to come from a nightmare. Sarah ran back into the ballroom, her friends behind her, but the restaurant was different. The tables and chairs, once arranged in a common manner, were now arranged to form a strange circle in the center of the restaurant. And in the middle of that circle, a figure was sitting with its head lowered, as if it was waiting for something. "We can't stay here," Lisa said, her eyes filled with panic. But before they could do anything, the figure raised its head. It was a woman, or what appeared to be a woman. His face was distorted, as if the flesh was melting and twisting, and his eyes were empty, pitch black. "You shouldn't have stayed," she whispered, in a voice that seemed to come from several directions at once. "Now they are part of me." The ground began to shake and a wave of cold swept through the room. The doors and windows closed by themselves, and the three were now trapped inside that nightmare. What was a simple night's work turned into a desperate fight for survival. The lights began to fail again, and the screams began to echo louder and louder, closer and closer. The woman, or whatever she was, walked towards them, her body deforming with each step. And as this happened, a growing sense of terror invaded the minds of Sarah, Noah, and Lisa. It was as if they were being watched, manipulated, like puppets on a dark, shadowy stage. "We have to get out of here now," Sarah shouted, pulling Noah and Lisa towards the door. But the hallway was now distorted, as if reality itself was being twisted around them. They ran, but the footsteps of those who were chasing them got closer and closer. When they finally reached the exit door, Sarah pulled the handle hard, but the door didn't open. It was locked, as if it had been sealed by some invisible force. And it was at that moment, when everything seemed lost, that they heard the final sound. The sound of the music, now completely distorted, playing the last note. And the figure, now approaching them, smiled. The restaurant was empty again, but for Sarah, Noah, and Lisa, the fight for survival was just beginning. Panic gripped the three friends as they desperately tried to open the door, their hearts racing and their breathing ragged. The grotesque figure approaching them seemed to float, its movements being slower but equally threatening. The restaurant, once a family-friendly place, was now an unforgiving prison. Sarah looked at Noah and Lisa, her eyes filled with fear, but also determination. "We need to be together," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "If we separate, we will be caught one by one." "Oh, what if we can't get out of here?" Noah muttered, his voice cracking. "What's going on, Sarah?" Before she could respond, the environment around them began to change again. The walls, which had once been solid and secure, now curved, distorting into impossible angles, as if the restaurant itself was twisting, altering its shape. The ground beneath his feet shook, and the lights flickered frantically, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. That's when Sarah realized the true terror. They weren't just trapped in that restaurant, they were being consumed by it. McDonald's, which had been built on land where ancient rituals had taken place, was alive, feeding on their souls, turning them into puppets of a force beyond their understanding. The sound of distorted music, which seemed like a macabre and repetitive chant, echoed throughout the place. The chairs and tables, previously in the shape of a circle, began to move on their own, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings, slowly rearranging themselves. In the center of the hall, the figure with the distorted face watched every movement, its presence omnipresent. "We can't stay here any longer," Lisa said, her face now as pale as a sheet of paper. She was starting to cry, but her voice was filled with fear so pure it seemed to tear the air. I don't want to die here." Sarah pulled Lisa close to her, trying to stay calm. "We'll go out, I promise, but we need to understand what is happening." What Sarah didn't know was that she was being watched. The walls of the restaurant, previously just a backdrop, seemed to come to life, as if they were breathing with her, following her every move. The shadow in the background, the figure with the distorted face, began to approach again, now with its eyes fixed on her. She felt a shiver run down her spine. "You think you can run away?" the figure whispered, his voice soft and venomous. This place belongs to you now. Your souls will be mine." Panic took over everyone again. Sarah knew she couldn't face this alone. She looked at the others, trying to find a solution. Suddenly, she remembered the only object that could help them, the key to the bottom, where there was a storage of old equipment. They could try to find something that could open the door, or at least help destabilize the force keeping them there. "Fast! Let's go to the bottom," Sarah ordered, pulling Noah and Lisa by the hand. But before they could take more than 2 steps, the restaurant began to shake violently, causing the lights to go out completely. In the absolute darkness, the sound of desperate breathing echoed throughout the restaurant. The noise of chairs being dragged, the distorted footsteps of the approaching figure were the only thing that broke the deadly silence. Sarah felt the pressure in her chest increase. She didn't know how much longer they could bear this. It was then that the figure appeared in front of him, emerging from the shadows with impossible speed. "I told you! You can't escape!" she hissed, now just a few feet away from them. Fear spread like fire through their bodies, but Sarah instinctively grabbed one of the chairs that was still nearby and threw it at the figure. But to his surprise, the chair passed through the creature, as if it were made of smoke. The figure laughed, a grotesque sound echoing through the empty space. "You tried to fight," she said, her face turning into a mass of twisted flesh. "But what you don't know is that McDonald's always wins." Then, the ground beneath them opened up. A huge crack appeared, and they fell, not into a physical pit, but into a space of dense, opaque darkness. The air around him was heavy, as if there wasn't enough oxygen to breathe. They were in a parallel dimension, where time and space made no sense, and the shadow that was chasing them was now everywhere. As they fell, Sarah felt intense pain, as if her soul was being pulled out of her body. She looked around, seeing Noah and Lisa also fighting against the supernatural pressure, but everyone seemed to be being sucked into the darkness, further and further away from the reality they knew. Lisa's last scream was interrupted by a wave of darkness that swallowed them, and all was silent again. When Sarah opened her eyes, the first thing she felt was an overwhelming emptiness. His head felt heavy, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. She tried to get up, but something was stopping her. Her hands were stuck to a sticky, cold surface, as if she were glued to a dense, viscous liquid. She tried to move, but something was wrong. The environment around him seemed to have no limits. There were no walls, no ceiling, just a vast expanse of darkness, a thick fog that stretched as far as his eyes could see. The air was thick, freezing, and Sarah could barely breathe. What had happened to her? Where was it? Then, a soft voice, almost like a whisper, made itself heard, reverberating in his mind. "You are where all those who get lost belong." Sarah scrambled to her feet sliding across the sticky surface. She looked around and saw Noah and Lisa in the distance, also trapped in that dark dimension, their faces disfigured by fear. They were so close, but the space between them seemed endless. "Sarah!" shouted Noah, his voice distorted, as if he was being torn apart by an invisible force. "What is that? Where are we? What happened to McDonald's?" Sarah tried to run towards him, but with each step, it seemed like the distance between them grew. The ground, or whatever it was alive, shifting beneath their feet, as if the environment itself had a malignant desire to keep them apart. She looked around, trying to find a way to escape, but there were no doors or windows. Just the dense, impenetrable fog covering everything. But then she saw it. In the center of the void, there was a faint, almost imperceptible light floating in the air. It was a familiar presence, but at the same time, terrifying. It was as if she was being drawn to this light, as if it was the key to their survival, but also the greatest danger they could face. "Sarah!" Lisa screamed, her voice cracking, full of dread. She was next to Noah, but their faces were pale, as if the dark energy was draining them. "Don't look at the light! Don't go to her!" But Sarah, moved by a force she couldn't understand, took a step forward, toward the light. Something inside her knew she had to go, that this light would take her somewhere, maybe to reality again, or maybe to the end. As she approached, the light seemed to expand, becoming more and more intense, until the darkness around her dissolved into small fragments, as if it were absorbed by the light. But there was something else there, a presence, something Sarah couldn't see, but felt in every fiber of her being. "You should never have come here." The hissing voice resonated in his mind, now louder, clearer. The distorted figure, the same one that had chased them, appeared in front of them, closer than ever. "This place is mine, and now you are part of it." Sarah tried to scream, but she couldn't make a sound. She was being pulled into the light, but she didn't want to go. The feeling of being swallowed by darkness and light at the same time paralyzed her. Every second seemed like an eternity, and with each moment, the distorted creature's voice seemed to grow stronger, more dominant. "I'm not the only one here," the voice spoke again, and this time Sarah felt a deep chill. "Those who lost their souls at McDonald's, they are with me, and you are becoming one of them." It was at that moment that she saw, from the corner of her eyes, the figures. They were there, on the edge of the light, men and women with indistinct faces, with twisted and disfigured bodies, as if they were being consumed by darkness itself. Their expressions were a reflection of suffering, a mark of the eternal prison of that place. The tension inside Sarah increased by the second. She was in a limbo between light and darkness, between life and death. And then she realized McDonald's, the restaurant where she and her friends had worked, wasn't just an ordinary place. It was a portal, a rallying point for lost souls, a place where those who succumbed to its darkness found themselves trapped, transformed into part of something greater, something much older. "You can't escape this. It doesn't matter what you do. You are a part of me now," the voice finished. Sarah looked at her friends. They were at his side now, but their faces were pale, blank. What was left of them was just the echo of the people they had been. They had been consumed, turned into shadows of themselves, lost forever in the dimension that McDonald's guarded. The next moment the light went out completely, and the restaurant McDonald's returned to what it always was. But Sarah, Noah, and Lisa were no longer ordinary people. They had become part of the essence of the place. And while the city and the interior of the state forgot what had happened that night, the three were now destined to wander in that limbo, condemned to an endless existence. The legend of McDonald's would never be the same, and the whispers of those lost souls would continue to haunt the place forever. When the darkness finally swallowed them, Sarah no longer knew what was real. The space she was in now felt like a vortex, a layer between dimensions where the laws of time and space made no sense. There was no reference to where it began or ended, just an empty abyss, an endless echo of screams and sighs, of lost souls trying to find a way. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. Her hands, which were once free, were now covered in a slimy layer that felt like the skin itself, trapping her tighter and tighter. The presence of the shadow, the creature with the distorted face, was stronger than ever, hovering deep in the darkness, waiting patiently. Sarah turned to Noah and Lisa, but their faces were blank, expressionless, as if they were mere puppets in the hands of an evil force. They were there, but they were no longer alive. They had been consumed, turned into shadows, part of the same essence that now dominated that dimension. "You made the right choice," the hissing voice said like a whisper in his mind. "You belong to me now, like everyone else who has lost their way here. McDonald's is a place that devours souls, and once you enter, there is no going back." The feeling of being trapped in this dimension was crushing Sarah. She tried to fight the invisible current that was pulling her down, but the feeling of helplessness grew with every second. The entity was not something that could be confronted or defeated. She was the place itself, the force that consumed everything and everyone. "Why are we here? What happened to McDonald's?" Sarah screamed, her mind a whirlwind of questions and anguish. "Don't you understand?" The shadow laughed. "McDonald's is not just a restaurant. It is a meeting place between the living and the dead, a gateway between the real and the supernatural. It is built on sacred ground where ancient rituals were performed. Every customer who enters, every soul that gets lost there, is part of a cycle that never ends." Sarah, in a last desperate effort, closed her eyes and tried to remember the moments before they were dragged into that dimension. She remembered when they walked into McDonald's that day. Everything seemed so common, so banal, but the true face of the place was much darker than they could have imagined. "What are we now?" Sarah asked, feeling the weight of the answer in her chest. "You are just like everyone else, trapped souls, condemned to wander in limbo. But this is not the end. This will never be the end." The voice sounded more distant now, as if the entity was moving away. Suddenly, the darkness began to melt away, and a distant light appeared in front of Sarah. It was faint, but it looked like a path. Maybe it was the last chance to escape. Maybe it was the only way out to the real world. But Sarah knew that no matter what she chose, nothing would be as it seemed. With an effort, she reached toward the light. But before he could reach it, the shadow figure appeared again, now enormous, swallowing the light with its overwhelming presence. His eyes, filled with insatiable hunger, fixed on her. "Do you think you can escape? This was never about escaping," the shadow said, his voice filling the dimension. "Now you are mine. And just like everyone else, you will become part of the eternal cycle of McDonald's." The weight of those words hit Sarah hard. She was doomed. There was no salvation. McDonald's, with its friendly, bright facade, hid something much older and more dangerous. Something she and her friends could never understand. The light went out, and Sarah fell back into darkness. But this time, she was no longer alone. All around her, she could hear the screams of other souls, trapped like her, condemned to an eternity of suffering. They were all there, together, in an endless prison, an echo of all those who had entered and never left. She looked around, but now, instead of Noah and Lisa, there were hundreds of familiar faces, people who had passed by before, who had been consumed, who had lost themselves. McDonald's wasn't just a restaurant. It was an abyss, a meeting point for lost souls. Sarah tried not to scream, but she knew she was becoming one of them. She was no longer a person, but a shadow, an echo, a part of the never-ending cycle. And as the restaurant in the real world continued to operate, the souls trapped in its dimension watched, waiting for the next to enter, the next to be consumed. McDonald's would never end. The cycle would never end. The emptiness was complete. Sarah felt her being disintegrate into invisible pieces, as if her soul was being ripped in different directions, pulled by forces she didn't understand. Every breath was an effort. The shadows around him whispered in an unknown language, a language that seemed to capture the deepest fears of his soul, amplifying them until they became unbearable. But deep in that thick darkness, there was something else, a feeling that the story was not over, that the cycle was not yet complete. Sarah knew, for some inexplicable reason, that a new customer was about to enter McDonald's, and he, like her, would be part of the cruel game everyone was trapped in. As time seemed to drag by, she looked around, searching for a way out, something that might offer a chance to break free. But the darkness never relented, as if it knew every attempt, every movement. The invisible walls of the prison where he was held firm, more implacable than any physical wall. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming echoed in the void, a familiar, almost comforting sound. Sarah froze. It was the sound of McDonald's, but not the McDonald's where she and her friends had worked. It was a new McDonald's, a McDonald's that now stood imposingly somewhere out of that abyss. The entrance door opened again, but this time a figure appeared at the entrance. A customer, a man with a calm face, apparently oblivious to what was about to happen. He entered with the same distraction as anyone else, as if the horror of that place were invisible to him. He was about to become another victim. Sarah didn't know what to do. She wanted to scream, to warn him, to tell him that he shouldn't be there, but his voice was silenced, trapped in an invisible chain, imprisoned in his new form. She tried to get closer, but the shadows around her began to move, to twist, as if they were more alive than ever. The presence of the dark entity increased. She felt for the first time that something was changing. The cycle was approaching its end, or perhaps it was just the beginning of a new cycle. The customer looked around, and Sarah realized he felt something. Something was wrong. He approached the counter, where the attendant was smiling mechanically, not realizing what was happening. But the customer stopped when he noticed a dark stain on the floor, something that didn't seem to be part of that place. He looked around uncomfortably, and then an icy sensation ran down his spine. Something was watching him. Sarah had known he shouldn't have come in. Not now. McDonald's had begun to change, as if it sensed the new customer arriving, as if it was preparing to swallow his soul the same way it had done so many others. The light that once seemed to be a path to salvation was now extinguished, as if it were a trap. The shapeless figures of lost souls began to appear around the man, slowly surrounding him. He took a step back, but the shadows followed him, crushing any chance of escape. The space around him began to distort again, as if reality was being bent and broken around him. "You shouldn't be here," the hissing voice spoke in her mind, the same voice Sarah had heard countless times. "Now, you are mine." The man tried to run, but his legs were paralyzed. He couldn't move. He was trapped like everyone else, in a reality that closed in around him. McDonald's, with its friendly, bright facade, was nothing more than an illusion. It was a point of convergence, a place where souls were collected, where the living became the dead. Meanwhile, Sarah, with one last effort, tried to get closer to the man. She saw him now, not as a living person, but as another soul about to be consumed. She wanted to help him, but she knew there was nothing else she could do. The cycle was complete. Then, when the entity appeared again, the creature that had hunted them from the beginning, it spoke with a tone of satisfaction. "You are all the same. Each of you, with your fragile souls, your fleeting lives, becomes part of something eternal." The client, now surrounded by darkness, did not have time to understand what was happening. He was swallowed by the shadows like so many before him. And so the cycle began again. But Sarah, now a shadow among shadows, felt something new. She didn't know if it was a remnant of humanity or if it was something more, something she couldn't understand. Something inside her stirred, a desire for release. She felt like maybe there was a way to reverse everything, to break the cycle. But instead of a path to freedom, she only found more darkness. A feeling of hopelessness took over her. McDonald's, this point of convergence, continued to operate in the real world, with its facade of normality, as if nothing had changed. And more customers would enter, more souls would be consumed, more victims would become part of that dark place. But deep down, Sarah knew the story wasn't over yet. The cycle of terror was far from over. And maybe, just maybe, someone else could find the key to cracking it. Sarah was starting to lose track of who she really was. She no longer saw herself as a person, but as a diffuse presence, an echo in the abyss of shadows and oblivion. His form seemed to crumble by the second, crumbling like fine sand being blown away by the wind. But there was something, an extinguished flame that was rekindling inside her. Something still kept her connected to reality, to the world she knew, a desire to resist, to escape that endless cycle. But how? How do you escape when darkness stretches across space, when McDonald's becomes an insurmountable prison, when every lost soul is part of a plan beyond your understanding? She knew she couldn't do it alone, but she also couldn't allow the next customer to be another victim. No more. With each step, the darkness seemed to thicken, trying to engulf her. The shadows moved, whispered incomprehensible words, and somewhere in the depths of that dimension, Sarah could hear the echoes of all the previous victims. Every soul that had been consumed by McDonald's was there, lost, screaming for help, but also resigned to fate. And that's when she heard the voice again. You don't understand, do you, Sarah? What you are experiencing now is a reflection of what you already were. You were already doomed before you even entered here. Sarah, unable to fight the voice, looked at the creature. She felt it but couldn't see it clearly. It was a vague presence, more like an idea than a concrete figure. But the voice was something very real, something that touched his soul. Who are you? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. I am what remains, what you will soon be. McDonald's is just the beginning, Sarah. It is a portal, a point of convergence. No matter how hard you try to fight, you will be a part of me. Sarah looked around. The light seemed to go out once more, but it was no longer just a light. It was a door that opened in the center of that dimension, and yet it did not appear to physically move. It was more like a sensation, a fissure in reality, that suggested that perhaps there was a way to escape, but where would it go? And more importantly, could she really escape? She approached the door. He didn't know if it was a trap, if what was happening was a simulation of his own mind, or if McDonald's was manipulating all of this in some way. But there was something about that door, something that felt familiar, something that recalled what she and her friends had lived in before, in the restaurant they had worked at, something that suggested that perhaps she was the key to breaking the cycle. As he approached, a vision flashed through his mind, a memory. The McDonald's from before, the regular restaurant where she and her friends had worked. It was as if the door was a fragmented version of what was behind it, something old, something she could no longer ignore. That's when she heard the sound of a familiar voice, a voice that made her freeze. Sarah! It was Lisa. She was there, or at least her voice was. Sarah looked around desperately. Lisa, where are you? Lisa's voice continued to call, but in an increasingly distorted manner, as if it was disintegrating into the darkness. Sarah, there is no escape. There is no turning back. McDonald's. It will continue. Even if you want to stop. Sarah looked at the door. She had to go, she had to cross, but something inside her stopped her. Maybe it was fear, maybe the lack of certainty. But she knew that walking through that door would mean leaving something behind, perhaps even the only chance she would have to solve what was happening in that place. Suddenly, The shadows around Sarah intensified. They began to form shapes, shapeless figures that began to approach in a threatening manner, as if their presence was growing stronger. There was an oppressive feeling, as if all the souls that had been consumed were there, somewhere around him. The creature, or whatever that dark presence was, appeared before her, larger than ever, its distorted and immense form swallowing any light. You will never be free, Sarah. McDonald's is your prison now, and you will be a part of it forever. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew this was a test. It wasn't just about escaping. It was about facing the truth. She looked at the door again. He felt that the decision was in his hands, more than ever. If she were to cross, it wouldn't just be an escape. It would be a confrontation, a last attempt to break the cycle, to free the trapped souls, to destroy what McDonald's stood for. With a courage she barely recognized in herself, Sarah took the final step towards the door. Darkness enveloped her, but this time she no longer felt alone. She knew that even if it wasn't possible to go back to what she knew, there was something bigger waiting for her. Something that she couldn't understand, but that perhaps could finally put an end to the nightmare. When she crossed, everything disappeared. In the real world, McDonald's continued to operate, with its lights shining and its customers coming and going as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the whispers persisted. The place had changed in some way, and no one knew exactly how or why. Somewhere, far beyond what the eye can see, Sarah and the lost souls were finally at peace. Or perhaps just waiting. McDonald's would never be the same.